Call the January 6, 2015 City Council meeting to order. We'll start with the invocation given by Mr. Bob Tullis. That will be followed by the pledge. If you would remain standing for both, please.
Father, we just come before you with thanksgiving. Thank you for the city we live in. Thank you for the people who administer it and those who serve in the legislative body. Thank you for the workers we have here in the Salem, our safety forces, our street workers, our utility workers, those people who work in the office. Lord, it is a dedicated group of people, and this city has every right to be proud of every person here. Be with our mayor and help him as he makes wise decisions for our city. Be with our council, help them to see forward into the future and to see the things that people will need. Thank you for the safety that we've experienced. Lord, we just ask your blessing on this meeting now. Your word says that if we ask for wisdom, you will grant it liberally. So we just ask for your wisdom to know the right things to say, the right things to do. We pray for your peace to be with us tonight. And we'll give you all thanks and praise in Jesus' name. Amen.
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 Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Now, this is the first meeting of the year, which is both the regular meeting and an organizational meeting. The first order of business, therefore, is to appoint the pro tem clerk. I'm going to appoint Mr. Whitehill to that position. Mr. Whitehill, therefore, if you would please call the roll.
Mr. Brown?
Here.
Mr. Cushman?
Here.
Mrs. Dickey?
Here.
Mr. Drummond?
Here.
Mr. Nestick?
Here.
Mr. Paparotis? Here. 7 present.
Thank you. The next order of business is the adoption of council rules. May I have a motion to adopt the rules governing council for the city of Salem? Mr. Cushman, is there a second? Mr. Brown? Mr. Whitehill, would you please call the roll?
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
Mr. Nestick?
Point of order, I was just going to ask, are we going to discuss, because there was a suggestion to change the rules that might be good?
If I may, Rule 32 of your rules that you may or may not adopt here in a moment does allow for the changing of those rules throughout the year, and actually requires that they be submitted in writing and go through the proper process, the Rules and Ordinance Committee, before coming back to council for amendment.
Okay, then yes.
All right. Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
7 yeas.
All right, thank you. The next order of business is the nomination of a candidate for clerk of council. Can I have a nomination from the floor for that position? Mr. Drummond,
I'd nominate Mrs. Debbie Bricker.
is there a second on that? Mrs. Dickey, would you please call the roll?
Whoop, 1 second, sorry. Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Nestick?
Yes.
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
7 yeas.
All right. Normally, we would have the swearing in by the mayor of the clerk, but she's off sick this evening, and so many people have the flu or different things that are going around at this time. At this time, then, I would move to the appointment of President Pro Tem. Do I have a nomination for that? Mr. Whitehill.
Mr. Nestick?
Is there a second on that? Okay, Mr. Drummond, would you please call the roll?
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
Mr. Nestick?
Yep. Okay.
7 yeas, Mr. President.
Thank you. I believe everyone received a copy of the minutes of the meeting of December 2nd, 2014. Are there any additions, corrections, or deletions to those minutes? Seeing none, they'll stand as approved. There's no petitions or remonstrances. I did not get the sheet from the podium, but I believe I know at least one person, Dr. Traina, signed in.
I'll get the sheet.
If you would, thank you, I appreciate that.
Well, I'm the only one on here.
You can just leave that there then. You have the floor.
Wow. Good evening.
Good evening.
Just a short note about what transpired in the Income Tax Department in our last meeting of the year, a week or two before Christmas. Mr. Paymer informed us that the state has passed, I think it's called, Dr. Conrad.
House Bill number 5.
House Bill number 5, that's making some changes in the income tax department. They want to make it uniform throughout the state. And he didn't have all the details. He said, "Oh, let me know as soon as he has all the details, and we'll call another board meeting, make sure we understand it. I'll come back here and inform you of whatever changes have to be made." And I think that's it, isn't it, Dr. Conrad? That's about it, isn't it?
My knowledge.
So we'll wait till we get all the information. And the last thing is, I wish everyone a very good 2015. And whoever told me I was going to be, I would keep to 10 seconds, I just went over it by a few seconds, so that's it. Thank you, but really, everyone have a great New Year.
Thank you, Dr. Traina. One thing that I see that I did go past is the council committee and liaison appointments. I felt that the committees functioned very well last year, and being the sports person I am, it operated very well as a unit. Therefore, I'm going to keep the committee appointments the same this year and the liaison appointments the same. And I will circulate that to everybody. I would have already, but I'm having some difficulty with my computer, which Mr. Zellers pointed out this evening, and I am aware of, but I will get that out to you. Seeing that we have no further visitors, move on to the report of city officials. Mayor Berlin.
Thank you, Mr. President. Tonight, I would like to reappoint members of different boards and commissions. Several of them are going to require council approval. The first few names do not require council approval, so I will tell you that Jeff Zimmerman has accepted my request to be renominated on the Civil Service Commission. Barbara Loudon and Kathy Gano both have accepted a reappointment to the Planning Commission. And John Banzot Sr. has also agreed to serve on the Parks Commission. Are there any questions about those 4 nominations? Okay. The following people have accepted reappointment to positions on boards and commissions, but do require your vote. I would like to do this by each board or commission, and so unless it's objected to, I would ask that Virginia Grilly and Steve Wallace both be confirmed by council for an additional 3 years on the Design Review Board.
Is there any discussion with regards to that? Mr. Drummond?
I think I would have to recuse myself from voting on the behalf of Ms. Grilly, since I'm married to her.
Anything further with regards to the names that were mentioned? Any questions, comments?
Would that then mean that they'd be voted on individually?
I would recommend that at this point.
Okay.
All right.
Then I would ask for a confirmation of an additional 3-year term for Virginia Grilli on the Design Review Board.
Right. Mr. Whitehill, if you please call the roll with that.
Certainly. Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
Mr. Nestic?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
6 yeas, Mr. President.
All right.
I would then ask for confirmation for an additional 3-year term for Steve Wallace on the Design Review Board.
Again, any discussion with regards to that nominee? All right, Mr. Whitehill, if you'd please call the roll with regards to that, please.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
Mr. Nestic?
Yes.
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
7 yeas, Mr. President.
All right, Mr. Mayor?
I would like to have council confirmation for Dr. Michael J. Trina for an additional 3-year term on the Income Tax Review Board.
Any discussion as to that nominee? Seeing none, Mr. Whitehill, if you'd please call the roll.
Mr. Nestic?
Yes.
Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Paparotis? 7 yeas, Mr. President.
All right, Mr. Mayor?
I would like council confirmation for the reappointment of Dave Nebiowski for a 3-year term on the Shade Tree Commission.
Any discussion as to that nominee? Seeing none, Mr. Whitehill, would you please call the roll?
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
Mr. Nestic?
Yes.
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
7 yeas, Mr. President.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor?
I would like to have the following 3 individuals receive council confirmation for 3-year terms on the Tourism Board. That would be Dan Engel, Janet Keene, and B.J. Abrams.
All right, let's go with one at a time then on that.
One at a time again.
It wouldn't be necessary, it's for the board in general, but unless there's a...
Whenever you-
Yeah, I think you can, we've done it in the past with the...
Any discussion with regards to the 3 nominees? Seeing none, Mr. Whitehill, would you please call the roll?
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Drummond?
Yes. Yes.
Mr. Nestic?
Yes.
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
7 yeas, Mr. President.
All right, thank you. Mr. Mayor?
I would like council confirmation for an additional 6-year term on the Utility Commission for Robert Hodgson.
Any discussion as to that nominee? Seeing none, Mr. Whitehill, would you please call the roll?
Mr. Nestic?
Yes.
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
7 yeas, Mr. President.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor?
I would like council confirmation for an additional 4-year term on the Board of Zoning Appeals for Mark Pitzerak.
Any discussion with regards to that nominee? Seeing none, Mr. Whitehill, would you please call the roll?
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
Mr. Nestic?
Yes.
Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
7 yeas, Mr. President.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor?
That concludes the reappointments, council confirmations, but I just want to add, all of these folks have currently been serving and agreed to serve again. I respect their decision, and I'm happy that they're willing to do that. And I certainly do thank all of the other members of all these boards and commissions that aren't being reappointed at this time, still have some time to serve, because finding people to work on these boards and commissions is often difficult, takes time away from them in their evenings, and we do appreciate it at City Hall, as well as I imagine the council appreciates their efforts. So that concludes my report.
All right, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Any questions for the mayor? Seeing none, Law Director, Attorney Zellers.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have no formal report, but I would request that we convene into an executive session at the conclusion of this meeting for a discussion on pending litigation.
Is there a motion to adjourn at the conclusion of this meeting into executive session? Mrs. Dickey first, Mr. Nestick second. Would you please call the roll, Mr. Whitehill?
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
Mr. Nestor?
Yes.
Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
7 yeas, Mr. President.
Right, and with that, Mr. Zellers, I assume that there is going to be no action
I would not be
taken.
requesting any, Mr. President.
All right, very good. And that is all you have then?
Yes, thank
All
you.
right. All right, the auditor, Mrs. Brothers.
Good evening and Happy New Year, all. In front of you, you have a couple of ordinances, and I was just wanted to present myself to answer any questions that you may have regarding the ordinances that are in front of you today.
All right, any questions? Mr. Cushman?
Thank you, Mr. President. Auditor Brothers, two of the ordinances that we have are wage-related ordinances, and I know they came out of Finance Committee. Could you please tell council briefly what they are and why they're before us tonight?
What these are is, one of them is the grandfathered one. It's for the people who already have positions, and we want to mirror them with what the unions received, which was 2.75, 2, and 2. So, and then the other one is a new wage ordinance. We changed the dispatches and the police secretary and the income tax clerk for a slight bump up as well. So that's why you have two ordinances in front of you for passage tonight.
Any further questions for Mrs. Brothers with regards to the ordinances or any other matters pertaining to her office? Mr. Drummond?
Well, I'm not sure if this is the time to talk about it or if it's time we to discuss the ordinance themselves, but is the funding, there's a position that's being introduced, the part-time clerk, part of the zoning office and perhaps the housing inspection office. Is there funding for that at this time?
No, and we're not asking for funding at this time.
You're just introducing the
We're
position?
just introducing the position.
Okay.
Any further questions for Mrs. Brothers? Mrs. Dickey?
I know that we added some positions during either this last year or the last part of last year before that, for a part-time clerk in the police department. Have we filled that? Because we were going to hold that until funds were available.
For the secretary?
It was going to be a part-time position.
The only part-time position that we had, that we were budgeting, that we had presented was to bring back the secretary.
Mhm.
And she's been with us for over a year.
Okay.
So that, yeah, that was funded and passed.
Do we have any other positions out there that have been created that are not filled at this time or funded at this time?
No.
Okay.
We have positions that have been around that we have never filled. There's positions on here that we don't have anybody, in those positions itself. There's, but we're not creating anything new.
And what positions are on the books now that are not filled?
There's a couple for utilities, like utility foreman 4, or, certain ones that have left, and the person hasn't, we haven't had anybody get the certification to fill those positions. Like if you had a 4 leave, and then they had a new person come, take over the foreman, they would have been a 3.
Okay. Okay.
Any other questions for Mrs.
Unrelated to the
Drummond?
ordinances, last year, we set aside money for each member of council, and I know from the third ward, I didn't spend it all. We still have that available to me?
Mhm.
Thank you.
Yeah, actually, nobody spent any, and it was all carried over again this year.
Have we not had to pay anything for our
The
entranceway?
signage?
Yes.
No, that hasn't been presented to us yet.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah, nothing has been spent out of that.
Thank
Any,
you.
any other questions for Mrs. Brothers? Seeing none, thank you.
Thank you.
Treasurer, Dr. Conrad. My understanding, Dr. Conrad indicated to me that he has no report, but if there are any questions for him. Okay. Safety Service Director, Mr. Kentz.
Thank you, Mr. President, Mayor Berlin, and members of council. I have a short report this evening. As all of you know, we've had a salt supply problem. We had no contract from ODOT this year, or last year over the carryover for this year. After the November we had, we got a little nervous. Our street department's done a fine job on being conservative with what we've had. December was very nice to us, but we knew that coming into the rest of this winter, we weren't going to be so fortunate. So we spent the whole month of December looking for other avenues to get salt, and we worked with ODOT. They were able to help us. We just found out last week we will be able to purchase on an as-needed basis from the county ODOT up to 600 tons to get us through the rest of this winter. We're going to stay on the conservative mode that we have been, which is basically mixing that with a lot of grit. The price is still going to be $102.70 a ton, because that's what everybody that had a contract had to pay. So at least we know we're going to get it. Our street foreman feels confident that we're going to be able to get through the winter with that, and hopefully anything we don't spend up to that 600 tons will be a savings to the city. Second thing I have is Mayor Berlin and I are working with Howes and Baird for a storm drainage project that includes Southeast Boulevard and Monroe, where we've had some flooding issues when we've had major storms. Jennings Avenue area is the same, and then we have an Eastview, Westview area is the same. All three of those are going to be combined into one project. We hoped by late winter, early spring will be the timeline to have the drainage project evaluation completed by Howes and Baird. So they're working on all three of those, but that's something we want to get done as early as we can this spring, or late spring or summer. And that's basically my report. I just want to, I'll take questions, but I want to pass on too that Mr. Weingart is out of town. Mr. Hoops could not make it tonight, but they wanted me to pass on that the regular Utility Commission meeting will be this Thursday, January 8th at 4 o'clock. And I'll take any questions.
Mr. Brown.
I would like to ask Mr. Kentz a question that can be answered with a simple yes or no. Have you granted anyone working under your authority to use their own discretion when it comes to enforcing rules and ordinances of Salem? Just a yes or
It's a tough
no?
one to answer.
Pardon?
I-
Not even a yes or no? Have you granted anybody authority to use their own discretion when it comes to enforcing rules and ordinances of Salem?
No, I mean, the police department
Well,
does their own job, so I
I
don't
know.
tell them what to do when they're making arrests or giving
okay.
citations.
I'll stop by your office and talk to you about it.
Yeah, please.
Has nothing to do with the police department.
Okay.
Mrs. Dickey.
I would like to know, have you had any reports from any of the street workers about problems with leaves around the drains and things in the city on the streets this year? Has that been an issue?
I think we haven't had an issue. I think there was an issue one time when we had a lot of rain. We had basically we were trying to get another project complete, so they cleaned some off of the storm drains, put them on the curb lawn, and then we were gonna come back and get them. But that's the only issue I know related to that.
Okay, because I had a complaint from a resident that there were several areas on his street that the leaves had accumulated around the drains, and he was concerned about them. So I did take a drive around the ward, and I did notice there were several places like that, and I just wanted to ask if you'd been aware of any.
Yeah, I am aware of one certain time, probably when the weather was still a little bit decent, that we did clean them off because they had to get other work done. They wanted to get those cleaned because we were expecting a lot of rain in the next couple of days, and they wanted to get them off the storm drains and up on the curb line. So I think they ended up getting them after the storms we had, but that's the only time that I've heard of an issue.
What they'd asked me is if I would consider an ordinance about getting rid of your leaves, especially around those areas. And I just wondered if that was a problem for you, if that's something that you felt needed to be addressed?
We do, there are certain areas that I know, I've heard from the street department, that people actually rake their leaves to the storm drains, and if they see that, then they contact the police department, because that is against our ordinances, so.
Yes.
So that does happen, and I know they do enforce that.
Okay. All right.
Any
Thank
other
you.
questions?
The 600 tons of salt that we got, the additional,
Yes.
what tonnage do you have prior to that?
Well, you know what, we had 600 tons, our barn only holds 600 tons.
Okay.
We had that to start the year, because we purchased it last summer. After November, we probably had still like 400 or 500 tons left, so we were pretty good.
What do you usually use in a?
Last year, we used probably 1,400 tons.
Really?
Because we had a tough winter. It just never ended last year, you know.
Yeah.
But if you have like one storm and then 2 weeks later you have another storm, it's not as bad.
Right.
And then, like last year, we were out every other day.
December was easy going, January's
We were
coming
lucky
in.
in December.
Coming in rough.
And it's
You-
supposed to, next week's supposed to get decent again, so.
Okay, is that right?
Yeah.
You said we take it on an as-needed basis,
Yes.
up to 600 tons.
Yes.
We would pay
What'll
for it,
happen is
we'll
once-
pay for whatever. we
Yeah,
can.
once the barn gets down, say 200 tons, then street foreman will call ODOT and say, I need 200 more tons to get us back up to.
And that's the point in time at which we pay for it.
Yes, correct. And if we only need 200 more tons, that's all we pay
Gotcha.
for, so that's I
Thank
think
you.
that's a real benefit. You know, it's not something we wanted, I mean, we normally get, but we'll take it this year.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions for Mr. Kent? Seeing none, thank you. Parks Director, Mr. Faber is not here. There'll be no report, as I indicated with Council Clerk. Oh, it's magic. Mr. Faber, do you have any report?
Thank you, Mr. President. I have no report, but I'd be glad to answer questions.
All right, any questions for Mr. Faber? Seeing none, thank you. Council Clerk, Mrs. Bricker is off sick. We'll move then to the report of standing committees. Finance, Mr. Cushman.
Thank you, Mr. President. My committee has not met. I have no formal report. This evening, I do have 3 ordinances, however. Could I ask for numbers, please?
All right, the first ordinance, that's dealing with the adjusting of salaries and wages. That will be number 1.
Thank you.
And then also, the ordinance dealing with non-represented city employees, the salaries and wages adjustment, that will be number 2. And then resolution designating the financial institutions as depositories for city funds, that will be number 3.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Cushman. Move on then to streets, alleys, and sidewalks. Mr. Paparotis.
My committee has not met, and I have no report today.
All right. Utilities, Mr. Brown.
My committee has had no reason to report, so I have no report.
Traffic and safety, Mr. Whitehill.
Thank you, Mr. President. My committee has not met. I have no report.
Rules and ordinances, Mrs. Dickey.
My committee has not met, but we do have 2 ordinances that came out of Planning Commission we'd like for second reading tonight.
All right, that's going to be number 80 and 82, I believe.
I
It's
believe
been
so.
returned. All right. Parks, Mr. Drummond.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Parks Committee did meet on December 9th at 6:30 PM here in Chambers. All members, Mr. Cushman, Mr. Paparotis, and I were present. The purpose of the meeting was to receive visitors, to give any updates regarding the possibility of a skate park in the city. Mrs. Cahill, Lisa Cahill attended, amongst others. She indicated that the group that she was representing has had several meetings regarding planning and organizing the process of coming up with a potential site. That group has identified in their minds the best site would be the parking lot behind City Hall, or behind, well, City Hall Police Station. They also talk, and to be fair to our pro temp clerk, I'm going to put this together, and he doesn't have to take all these notes. I will, the idea of the park in that location being close in proximity to safety services, both the police and the fire. In the event of injury, the fire department's close at hand, and by having it close to the police station, it has the ability to, or the hope to prevent unwanted individuals from hanging, lurking around. They also talked about, brought to the table that they would plan on introducing an interchangeable type of park that, you know, can be configured for different uses and so on, and that would go from just normal skateboarding to rollerblading to bikes and so on. So the main discussion was around that location and the viability of it, and I indicated at the time that I would take that to the administration to see what the likelihood. I haven't done that, and I apologize to that group that I haven't done that yet. But I will make arrangements to talk with the administration to see if there's any chance that's happening. I did point out that there's a good chance that they may not agree to it if we have a Plan B. Other than that, I'm not sure if we've got to that yet. But regardless, the group is looking for, if the city is prepared to give them some piece of land or the use of some land, they would like to see some sort of long-term agreement. They don't want to go ahead and put the money out to produce this. You'll recall it, as the cities and the parks department funds are limited, we said that they probably would have to seek and have their own funding to create that. The group obviously is saying they don't want to do that if there's any chance they would lose the use of that whatever location. So they would be looking for a long-term agreement, perhaps with something like a $1 per year lease on that. They'd also hope to have the access to any of the old pieces of the skateboard park that existed some years ago. And I indicated I didn't think that would be an issue, but we'll confirm that with the Parks Department itself. In a nutshell, that's it. I have some to-dos. I have to talk to the administration to see about that property, if that's not. Now, the other possibility is whether the city has any other pieces of land that they thought might be available that they're not utilizing that might fit into the plans for a skate park. And if anybody's out there that has some land that they thought might be able to volunteer the use of or donate, we'd certainly welcome that as well. I think that's all I have for now before, I'm just going through my notes really quickly. I should have had these prepared. I've been, tied up with the holiday and other events. So if anybody has any questions, I'll try to answer them.
Any questions for Mr. Drummond? Seeing none, thank you. Economic Development, Mr. Nestic.
The Economic Development Committee did not meet. We do not have a report.
Committee of the Whole, Mr. Nestic.
Committee of the Whole did not meet. I did try to get a meeting scheduled, sent out a scheduling tool via email to a number of people. Got a number of responses. Some did not respond, but I could not get the right amount of people or the correct people together for a Committee of the Whole meeting to schedule it. I will be getting another scheduling tool out, so please look for it, everyone. And the topic of that meeting is to discuss events, managing events, and the tourism board, and what we do about major events going forward.
Okay. Mrs. Dickey.
Mr. Nestic, I was going to request this last meeting with the permission of Mr. Paparotis that we need to call this meeting of the Committee of the Whole to talk about this motorcycle rally. And I'd really like us to do that as quickly as possible. Mr. Johnson has been very kind to volunteer his services to get this organized and to do a lot of the legwork, and has already done a lot of legwork on it. But the time is dwindling down very quickly, and he needs to have an answer of how we're going to handle this and if we're going to handle this.
Mr. Nestic.
I will say again that I got a scheduling tool out 2 weeks ago, and I didn't get some responses, and I need to get the right people at that meeting, and it will get scheduled, and it will get scheduled as soon as possible.
Okay.
Good point.
Any other questions for Mr. Nestic? Mr. Drummond.
I'll own up to being one of the people who didn't get back to you.
I wasn't going to name names.
And I'm looking at the tool now, and I see there's 7 people available for next Tuesday night, the 13th.
Mhm.
If you're willing to have it then, and if they have the necessary people there. I hope I'm not just the only I don't think I'm that important.
I'd
But I
like to
could
give
make
it
it
one
the
more,
13th.
I'd like to give it one more try to get at least a service director there also.
Okay.
And I want to make sure that we have council people there.
All right.
Because we have 2 council people that are missing that evening.
All right, I'll
already.
be sure to reply to this one quicker.
Okay.
Any other questions or comments for Mr. Nestic? Seeing none, that concludes the standing committee reports. We'll move on to second and third reading of ordinances and resolutions. Mrs. Dickey.
How are we going to handle this since we don't have the clerk and, do you have the ordinance?
Yes, he does.
Okay, I wasn't sure since it wasn't on our
We
agenda.
are prepared.
Okay, I would like
Had
to
some
ask,
assistance.
Mr. President, that you have the clerk read ordinance 80 by title only for its second reading tonight.
Would the clerk please read ordinance number 80 by title only for its second reading this evening?
Being an ordinance amending section 1143.06 of chapter 1143 of title 3 of part 11 of the codified ordinances of the city of Salem regarding cooperation of city officials.
Right. Mrs. Dickey.
I would also ask that you ask the clerk to read ordinance 82 for its second reading tonight.
Would the clerk please read ordinance 82 by title only for its second reading this evening?
Being an ordinance amending section 1195.03N of chapter 1195 of title 7 of part 11 of the codified ordinances of the city of Salem regarding general requirements for all signs and districts.
Thank you. That concludes the second and third reading of ordinances and resolutions. Move on then to introduction of ordinances and resolutions. Mr. Cushman.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to suspend the statutory rule so that ordinance number 1 can be read for the first, second, third reading tonight.
All right, is there a second on that? Mr. Brown? Would the clerk please call the roll?
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
Mr. Nestic?
Yes.
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
Who did I miss? Mr. Drummond? I think Mr. Drummond. Did I get you? Mr. Brown?
Mr. Brown.
Yes.
Sorry. Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Yes.
Very good.
7 yeas, Mr. President.
Thank you. Mr. Cushman.
Mr. President, I move that the clerk read ordinance number 1 by title only for its first, second, and third reading with emergency clause for passage tonight.
All right. Would the clerk please read ordinance number 1 by title only for its first, second, and third reading this evening with emergency clause?
Being an ordinance to supersede ordinance 140304-18, establishing and adjusting salaries, wages, and other benefits for non-represented city employees and non-represented city and elected officials of the city of Salem, repealing all prior inconsistent ordinances herewith and declaring an emergency.
Is there any discussion? We'll start with Mr. Nestic.
I just want to point out for consideration, I had a discussion with the auditor today, and this ordinance handles, the different salary levels of the different elected officials and non-bargaining, and in 2012, all the elected positions started to step up every year from 2012 through 2015. The only elected positions that haven't been adjusted at all for the past 8 years are city council positions. And it's becoming increasingly difficult to find people to run for office because it's really not that, there's a lot about it that's not that rewarding. As of January 1st, 2014, the Ohio Public Employees Retirement System changed also so that if the earnings are less than $600 a month, you don't get full credit for a year served in the OPERS system. So what I discussed with the auditor was what would the impact be if council positions were changed to $600 a month, but if the council people had to pay the full load of the OPERS, which would be the city half and the employee half. This way, the impact on the city would be the least, but you're providing an extra benefit for the position of city council. and you're taking care of the one position that hasn't been changed in 8 years. So I defer to the auditor. She was going to look something up to see if that's even possible to have someone pay both sides. And I don't know if you've had a chance to do that yet. And the other question that I had of the law director was if there is going to be any kind of change like this that's even considered, I believe there's a deadline before the filing deadline for elections or something that has to do with the change of these.
That's correct, Mr. Nestic. I believe the change would have to occur, we have 4 positions coming up next?
Yes.
Yeah. Would have to occur, might be 90 days before that
90
filing
days before.
deadline.
When's the file? I don't even know when the filing
I
deadline is.
believe it's February.
February 4th.
Is it the 4th? Yeah, it's early,
Mm-hmm.
February.
I'd still consider that we take a look at that for any future positions, period.
Mhm. I'm not, don't hold me to the 90 days, I'm not sure why I think that, but definitely would have to happen before the filing deadline so that any person considering that position had a full understanding of what the wages and benefits would be for that position. I would have to look into that to give you a definitive answer. We need to do it soon, although if it is 90, we're already too close anyway.
If it's 90, then there's no hurry, but I think we still should consider it with this ordinance.
Yeah.
But if it's, if it's not 90, then it's something that we should consider more rapidly. So with that, I wouldn't use it to hold this up. I just wanted to point that out in this ordinance.
With that, would that need to be taken care of as a part of the ordinance, or could it be addressed at a later point in time?
It could certainly be done by an amendment to this ordinance at any time. I mean, this thing's come back and forth numerous times with small changes here and there, and that could be one that could be readdressed if it can still be fit in that timeline and council was so inclined.
All right. Is there any further discussion? Mr. Drummond?
Not on that.
Well, that's,
Anything else, though?
anything else with regards to this?
I'd like to, I alluded to this during the auditor's report about this creation of this position, this part-time position for the zoning and the housing office. And,
What page are you referring to, if you would please?
it's page 6, I guess, under number 4, Service Department. That's where
Thank
it
you.
talks about the hours, and then I think it's on page 7 under miscellaneous provisions, multiple allocations. There's also reference to there. I personally am not convinced at this point in time that position's needed. Since we're not funding it at this point in time, I'm wondering why we're creating it if we don't know we actually even need it, and we have no funding to fund it. So, with that in mind, I'd like to make a motion that we remove that piece of that ordinance so that we can pass the rest of it.
All right, is there a second with regards to that? Mr. Brown? All right, discussion on the motion then. Mrs. Dickey?
You know, we were asked to raise fees for the inspections on the rentals earlier in the year, and that was a really hard thing for me to do because I don't particularly care for raising the expenses of the citizens at this time when our economy is just trying to come back. And so I did it because we were convinced that there was a need to fund that department and the work that they were doing, and that the amount that we raised it would cover those expenses. And so for me to vote to make another position within that department at this time makes me wonder, are you going to come back and say, well, we have to raise something else on our citizens to fund that? You know, I really would be very careful about adding bigger government. I think there are a lot of other needs in the city that we could put money toward than doing that, unless there's been shown a need that we weren't able to do what we're doing. We get a report every month from the housing inspector on what he did, how many failed, things like that. And it might be a nice thing to see that from zoning also, so that we could see where the need is before we create a position that could potentially cost the city more money in administration fees.
Mr. Nestic?
You know, I view this as a management decision, and it's not a funded position right now. I mean, it's just adding some flexibility to the system. We do constantly, at times, hear from some people how, you know, there's problems with response or whatever in zoning, and you know, this is something that you know, if the management sees a need, and if this could help solve that issue, if there is an issue, then I don't see any reason why the position shouldn't be created so that management has the flexibility to do that. It's going to have to come back to council anyhow to fund it, so I don't see a harm in it.
Any further discussion or comment with regards to the motion? Seeing none, if the clerk would call the roll on the motion.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Just to be clear, this is the motion to strike the,
That is correct.
no.
Mrs. Dickey?
No.
Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
Mr. Nestick?
No.
Mr. Paparotis?
No.
Mr. Wayhill, no.
Can I ask a question? It's no to strike or no to keep?
You're voting to, it would be, if you vote yes, it's to pass the motion.
The motion was to remove that position, so you would have to be in favor of the motion to remove that, the language from this ordinance.
This is very confusing. Okay, I would like to remove it, so I would want to vote yes
Yes.
instead of no, correct? Okay.
If that's what you wish to do, that
Yes, I'm sorry.
would be correct.
That's 3 yeas.
Did you guys?
3 yeas, 4 nays. Okay. The motion does not carry. Move back then to the ordinance itself. Is there any further discussion with regards to ordinance number 1? Seeing none, if the clerk would go ahead and call the roll then, please, for ordinance number 1 for passage this evening.
Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
Mr. Nestick?
Yes.
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
I vote yes, 7 yeas.
All right, ordinance number 1 passes this evening with 7 yeas. Mr. Cushman.
Mr. President, I move to suspend the statutory rules and ordinance number 2 can be read for the first, second, third reading tonight.
All right, is there a second on that? Mrs. Dickey. If the clerk would please call the roll on the motion to suspend the statutory rules.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
Mr. Nestick?
Yes.
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
7 yeas.
All right, Mr. Cushman?
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the clerk read ordinance number 2 by title only for its first, second, and third reading with emergency clause for passage tonight.
All right, would the clerk please read ordinance number 2 by title only for its first, second, and third readings this evening with emergency clause?
Being an ordinance to replace ordinance number 130618-48, establishing and adjusting salaries and wages for current non-represented city employees of the city of Salem, superseding all prior inconsistent ordinances herewith and declaring an emergency.
All right, is there any discussion? Mr. Drummond?
Maybe this is directed to the auditor. I noticed the difference between the one we're replacing and this one. You've broken it down a little clearer, which I appreciate, the department managers, et cetera. This one that we're doing includes the safety service director. The last one didn't. I didn't see the safety service director listed on 130618 48. Unless it got cut off when I printed it, I'm not sure.
It's because at that time, he was a new employee and he was off the new employee sheet. That was grandfathered for people who were hired before the specific date. Because if you notice, the deputy auditor isn't on there as well, on the original one. They were still on the new hire ordinance.
Okay, all right.
All right. Any other questions, comments, discussions? Seeing none, would the clerk please call the roll on ordinance number 2 for passage this evening?
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Nestic?
Yes.
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
7 yeas, Mr. President.
Thank you. Mr. Cushman.
Mr. President, our agenda is calling this a document and ordinance, but the document itself reads as a resolution, so I'm going to read it as a resolution.
That is fine.
Clerk Pro Tem, will you please read Resolution 3 by title only for passage tonight?
Mr. Cushman, with this, we would still, for all 3 readings, if we're dealing with a resolution that's just thanking somebody or is along those lines, then we just give it a first reading. If it's a resolution that's actually dealing with legislation that's going to be changing something such as the financial institutions as depositories in this case, then we would have to go ahead and follow the regular protocol with that, even though it's a resolution.
Mr. President, I need to continue taking my own type of notes, and one day I promise to have this accurate.
You're doing fine.
With that,
So you'd be asking for the statutory rules to be?
we need to suspend council rules. Did not come out
Did
of
it not come out of
committee.
council? Okay, then yes.
I move to council suspend council rules so that resolution number 3 can be considered tonight.
All right, is there a second on that? Mrs. Dickey, would the clerk please call the roll?
Mr. Nestic?
Yes.
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
7 yeas, Mr. President.
All right, council rules are suspended. Mr. Cushman.
Mr. President, I move to suspend statutory rules so that resolution number 3 can be read for the first, second, and third reading tonight.
All right, there's a second with that. Mrs. Dickey, would the clerk please call the roll?
Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Nestic?
Yes.
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
7 yeas, Mr. President.
Thank you. Statutory rules are suspended. Mr. Cushman.
Mr. President, I move the clerk read resolution number 3 by title only for its first, second, and third reading with emergency clause for passage tonight.
All right, would the clerk please read resolution number 3 by title only for its first, second, and third reading this evening with emergency clause?
Being a resolution designating financial institutions as depositories for funds of the City of Salem, Ohio pursuant to Chapter 135 of the Ohio Revised Code and declaring an emergency.
Is there any discussion? Seeing none, would the clerk please call the roll on resolution number 3 for passage this evening?
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mr. Nestic?
Yes.
Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
7 yeas, Mr. President.
All right, resolution number 3 passes. That concludes the introduction of ordinances and resolutions. At this time, as we had indicated, if we go into executive session, prior to that, we will go ahead with pleasure of council at this time. That way, when we come back from the executive session, it will just be to adjourn the regular meeting, and that way people don't have to hang around for no reason with regards to this, as we will not be taking any action on the executive session. With this, Mr. Cushman.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have nothing this evening.
Mr. Paparotis,
Thank you, Mr. President. Just wishing everyone a happy new year.
Mr. Brown,
I have nothing this evening, thank you.
Mrs. Dickey.
I want to thank all the people who were reappointed to the committees and commissions tonight. I've worked with several of them on the different functions that they do, and they really spend a lot of time and a lot of thought and a lot of hard work. So thank you very much. And I'd also like to extend my condolences to Mr. Drummond and his wife on the loss of his mother this past week.
Thank you.
I think that everybody would echo that sentiment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Nestick,
I have nothing tonight, thank you.
Mr. Drummond,
Thank you again for that. We've heard a lot in the news lately about the issue of police and people taking actions against the police based on some decisions made by different courts and so on. And while we're not New York City, I think everybody should agree that our police, every time they put on their uniform and step out the door, they don't know what's going to happen. And if you haven't done so, I think it wouldn't be such a bad idea to, next time you meet face-to-face with them, thank them for their service, just as you might thank a member of the military for their service. And same goes with the fire department. Again, they don't know what they're going to do, what they're going to come up against whenever they start their shift. So I think I, for one, like to extend my thanks to all our safety services and the job they do.
thank you very much. Mr. Whitehill.
Thank you, Mr. President. Certainly, well said, Mr. Drummond. And I would just add with the cold snap, just ask people to check on their neighbors, bring your pets inside.
Very good. I would say that Mr. Whitehill did an admirable job this evening as he was thrown into this at the last moment. It's like the second-team quarterback coming in at the beginning of the game and didn't know they were going to start the game. He did a very fine job this evening. That concludes the pleasure of council. We would adjourn into executive session at this time. Thank you.